Welcome to this episode of Your Places or Mine, Wypon Pod, with me, John Goodall, the architecture editor of Country Life.
And me, Clive Aslett, publisher of Triglyph Books.
Well, this week we're going to go in a completely different direction. We are always going in different directions. And we're going to talk about what, Clive?
Well, we're going to talk about Great Fires. The Great Fire, not of London in this case, but
Northampton. Indeed, this sort of really curious series of massive fires that take place in the late 17th century, and of which the Great Fire of London is, of course, by far the most famous. But this year is the 350th anniversary of the Great Fire of Northampton, which in its own way is similarly destructive and has lots of really fascinating parallels.
yes, and if I could just interject here, John, I wrote a piece once about the Great Fire of Marlborough. Oh, 1653. So there were all these fires destroying English towns. Now, what was the problem?
Yeah, well, it's a very interesting question, isn't it? It must be partly the sheer weight of population. In other words, these towns have grown to a sufficient size and are sufficiently densely developed that all these building materials that have always been used in these towns suddenly become a problem. And of course, that's one of the big consequences of all these fires is that, and particularly the Fire of London, is suddenly there are building regulations and the materials of towns change fundamentally. But I mean, it's a really interesting, as a group, they also, I think, have a really important effect on architecture generally, because it's the people who are employed in rebuilding the towns who become the next generation of major builders of country houses. So there's a very interesting reorganisation of the whole building industry through them. There's another Great Fire of Warwick, of course.
I think we did Blandford Forum have a... And there are fires all over the place.
There are fires all over the place. I think Glasgow has one. I mean, there really are fires in all sorts of different places. And it must be, I think, this that urban centres are just getting to that critical level where if you use timber frame and thatch and all those other things in the right circumstances, there can be catastrophes.
Yes. I remember reading that, of course, fire was used for all sorts of purposes. I mean, baking bread, for example, in the case of the Fire of London. But in the case of the Great Fire of Marlborough...
Yes, tell us.
I knew that you were wanting to know about it, John. It started in a tannery because in the tanning process, which was very unpleasant, of course, because it used nasty things and made a great smell. But one of the things it used was bark. And for some reason, they dried the bark, and they dried the bark using fire, because that's what you had to do. And so there were not only all these, I don't know why they tried it, but they did, to preserve it possibly for next year's use or something. Anyway, there were all these purposes for fire all over the place. And then, of course, all this, timber that had been seasoned and was stacked outside the houses. So, there was a great supply just of the material for fire because people had to use fire all the time.
Well, it's quite interesting. I mean, unlike this, I mean, we'll come to the narrative itself, but I mean, there's a degree of uncertainty is exactly how the Great Fire of Northampton starts. There are various different stories. I think it's really fascinating with the Great Fire of London that we do know exactly when and where it began. This very precise identification, Mr. Fariner,
yes,
the King's baker. And I had a very amusing time. So a scholar called Dorian Gerhold a few years ago found a survey of London, which precisely identified his property and his yard.
Good grief.
And you can overlay it. If you remember the great memorial, the fire memorial in the city.
Monument.
Of course, the monument. It actually is, as it explains in its long inscription, it's actually a particular distance from where the fire began. And I had a very amusing time with this document. We worked out exactly where the fire began. And I had to get bits of paper to create an X. And I laid them on the ground in the middle of what is now a road. And photographed them to show X marks the spot where the Fire of London started. Because you can identify that with this survey, because we know that it's his wood, the faggots of wood for his bakery, and you can identify, I think, I'm not making this up, you can see the ovens, you can see the yard, and you can see the shed, and you can precisely
get the very spot.
So X marks the spot, and there's quite a funny photograph. I was desperately...
Isn't the monument, its height is the distance that it is from the fire? Is that correct?
Exactly, and the point of the monument is that you went over London Bridge, the one bridge in London before Westminster Bridge in the 18th century. You came over it, and it's built on the street as you rise up into the city. And so the point of it was that you passed it as you came into the city on the main thoroughfare, but it marked a spot which is not on that spot. It's the spot that certain distance away. It's a very old thing.
Complex idea, but of course it was all very mathematical or scientific, the monument, wasn't it? So and they conducted scientific experiments inside it.
Indeed, and they want it to be on the main thoroughfare.
Yes, I see, of
obviously.
Course. Yeah.
But I mean, this idea that it has to relate precisely to the spot is peculiar, because you normally put a monument on the spot, don't you?
Quite.
Anyway.
Ingenious, yes.
Anyway, all that's by the by.
But as you were saying that the fire affected the building industry, of course, it reminds me that, there are all those country house fires like Windsor Castle and Hampton Court and Park, which also generate a lot of craft skill in this, at a different level, obviously, for very high-end restorations. Because we need the craftsmen. So, I mean, it's a similar sort of thing in a way.
And it is, I think it's exactly the same, isn't it? Fire being used for all kinds of things in the context of country houses. And of course, they're incredibly vulnerable. But as recent
events... Well, they were always burning down.
Yes, they're always burning down. Yeah. And as recent events have shown, still a problem, particularly when you're doing building works. But we're doing this episode back to front because we're talking about the effect before we talked about
of course.
And all the parallels.
And we were on the edge of our seat, John. To hear more about the Great Fire of Northampton.
No, well, I should just say that one of the reasons we know so much about it is that there are various accounts written of Northampton. I mean, obviously, Northampton is a very prosperous market, county town, outside London, or at least a lot of places. It's often described in relation to London, quite revealingly. It's on the road south to London. And it's a prosperous place. And there are a series of pamphlets published immediately after the fire, which is, disastrous. It destroys most of the town. About 700 families are made homeless by it. And in these accounts, there are differing versions of what actually happens. And all of them seem to involve a poor woman, but an anonymous one. And she is variously described as warming water, or as gathering coals from a neighbour to warm her supper, or just simply there is a fire in her house. And she has a house at the very western side of Northampton, very close to the castle, and all these different things describe it being thatched. There's been an unseasonably dry period of time, of season. The thatch catches fire, and there's a very strong wind, all kind of common features of these things. And it catches fire, the thatch catches fire, and then the wind carries the fire through the whole town, basically. It takes place on a Monday morning, September the 20th, 1675. It's just after the harvest. It's a really interesting detail. It's just after the harvest, so there are ricks of corn and hay, and these feed the blaze, and also it causes a problem afterwards because
starving.
There's no food. So initially, we're told in one of these accounts that people aren't really concerned because it's just one end of the town. But then the wind carries it across, and different people respond in different ways. Some try and save their houses by putting, we're told, damp rugs over the building, because, of course, it's really the sparks that are sending the flames from place to place. And others take all their goods out of their houses and stack them in the marketplace. And others put them in the church. But the fire burns the church, melts the bells, the main church in the centre of town, All Saints. But also, because they've stacked all their goods, others have stacked their goods in this very broad marketplace around the town cross. The sparks catch fire on the things, and it leaps over the marketplace. So all the natural divisions that might have saved parts of the town from the fire are burnt through. It seems to start about in the late morning, and it burns through to the evening. James Compton, who's the Earl of Northampton, living just outside the city bounds, he hears news. He's also a town official. He hears news of the fire. He comes and he watches what's going on for a period into the evening, see how the fire progresses, and the next morning he calls a meeting of all the local gentry in the town hall. And the town hall has apparently escaped only with its door being burnt and the staircase in front of it that took you upstairs being burnt off. And
It must have been wood then.
It was so the staircase is wood. So I mean, they arrive in the morning, and the town is clearly completely devastated. Interestingly, John Evelyn, the diarist, he visits Northampton very, very shortly before the fire, and he describes it as a ragged town. I mean, it's clearly it's a very wealthy medieval town, and presumably it's largely timber frame. It's very, it's a rambling plan. You imagine it's got quite big medieval suburbs too, but those aren't generally affected. But the centre of the town
sounds very combustible.
Yeah, indeed. Anyway, it's all burned through, and immediately the Earl of Northampton sees that what needs to be done, there need to be funds to feed people, there need to be funds to rebuild the town. He pledges the very substantial sum of £100 towards rebuilding the town, £20 towards feeding the poor, and very quickly there are arrangements in place for distributing food and creating shelter. But because of the Fire of London, they also know what they need to do.
Yes, I was wondering about that.
Yeah,
because after the Fire of London, it was like a refugee camp, wasn't it?
Exactly. So I think the Fire of London is this, a very important moment of, sort of a learning moment for the administration, because this great city completely burnt out, totally devastating, and they work out that they need a court of the fire, which will decide on boundary disputes, that will set things to allow the rebuilding to go ahead in London.
Yes.
And what takes 6 months to work out in London takes 6 weeks to work out in Northampton. One of the people who's a commissioner of the fire in London lives on the outskirts of Northampton and is involved in the fire. So there are really, really direct connections between the two. So what's happened in 1666 in London is seen as a blueprint for how Northampton will recover in 1675.
Yes, how interesting. If only the authorities at the time of the Great Fire of London, John, had learnt from the Great Fire of Marlborough. I'm not quite sure what happened, but at least in terms of that. But it was interesting that the fire was, like Northampton, almost total. I think about 80% of the town was destroyed. And it was... it didn't cause much loss of life. I mean, the Great Fire of London, I think almost nobody was... I mean, a couple of people were killed, but in a very small number in relation to the total, because people could see it coming. In the case of the fire at Marlborough, the principal victims were three Dutchmen who'd been imprisoned for some reason, and they were trying to rescue a cheese. Unfortunately,
as a national habit,
seems a very Dutch occupation. I have to say, we have listeners around the world, John, to this podcast. So
you've got to be careful.
We say that in a tone of greatest respect to those who might be in the Netherlands.
Yes,
but there wasn't great loss of life, but there was total destruction, and this was 1653. And during the course of the Civil War, I'm sorry to say that Marlborough had been strongly parliamentarian.
Yeah, well, this is
and the noble Lord Digby, such a great courtier, had been initially unable to take it up. Actually took it in the end. Anyway, it has stood out so well that when the townspeople appealed to Oliver Cromwell, he allowed them to, I think, make a proclamation, and that was an established system whereby a charitable appeal could be made from every pulpit in the country on Sunday, and it raised some money to restore it. But the other interesting thing is, of course, the town then becomes a one single date, and we can date the houses because we know they're post 1653, or very shortly after.
And that wonderful merchant's house.
Well, that's really an extraordinary thing which has risen to public prominence recently due to a very valiant local trust which has restored one of these houses that was rebuilt. And it is absolutely fascinating that it is, we see this house, it's on the high street opposite the market house, and it's got 3 beds. By the way, Marlborough also has got a very broad high street because it was one of those towns in which the market took place on the main street. There wasn't a market square. It's just that the main street widened out sufficiently for there to be a market hall and so on. Anyway, and so quite how the fire leapt that division.
distance.
I don't know, but I think there were all these sort of bits of burning thatch, and they rose up into the air, and there were sparks, but there were also actually these sort of wads of burning material, I think. But this house of 3 bays, tile hung with three gables. I think it was really on 2 plots, which I think somehow was maintained inside in case anybody ever wanted to knock part of it down. But in the centre, there's another 3 little gables. Anyways, it's a really charming...
And with wall paintings and things
But
inside.
that's the extraordinary thing. These wall paintings inside are very colourful. I mean, some of them must have been post-restoration, so they're not so surprising. They're bands of colour, rather in a medieval...
It's paled, these loom widths of cloth of different colour laid vertically at great paling.
And they must have hung, originally they were hung as strips of cloth.
That's right.
And then they became a painting thing that people did.
It's all wall paintings pretty much are imitations of fabric design.
Yeah. But it was... The chap who lived in this house was a weaver, a silk weaver, a silk merchant, rather.
So he had an interest in...
But, even the Cromwellian decoration is very colourful. It's not what you'd expect. All these Puritans in this very Puritan town going around dressed in black. But the interior certainly had elements of colour, even in the 1650s. It's quite interesting.
There are in London, Wardrobe Court is one of these developments that still survives immediately post-1660s within the city. And I went and saw some restored fireplaces. There's sort of scenes of rural life painted above fireplaces. Quite interesting in a Dutch manner in these 1660s, 1670s houses. Amazing, that they survive in the city.
Well, it's very surprising, because the merchant's house was the house of a merchant. It wasn't a country house, and so it's quite an unusual survival, something of that kind of layer of society. It's not very, very high-end, prosperous, but it's unusual that they survive. But, of course, the colour, you would expect there to be colour and stuff post-1660, when Charles II came back onto the throne and was all jolly again.
I see what you mean.
Yes, thought that in this particularly Puritan town, they might not have been so self-indulgent.
No, it's interesting. It's also, Northampton, going back to Northampton, there aren't, I seem to remember, very many fatalities there either. There are a group of people who are killed when a chimney piece falls down after the fire. I think there's a beggar or somebody selling food, and a chimney collapses on 2 people. And you can imagine in a timber frame house, the chimney stack is the only thing that's of stone.
Oh, yes, of course.
Yeah. There's also really rather wonderful, there's a travel writer called Baskerville who visits Northampton, and he describes the complete devastation after the fire. But there's one pub called The Last, which is mysteriously has survived, and he speaks to the innkeeper, and the innkeeper explains that when the fire was burning, he got some friends to lift a hogshead of beer up to the upper part of the building, and by pouring it carefully down the side of the building, they were able to cool the front of the building.
How amazing. Good Lord.
And so the Last is this one inn that survived. It was the last to survive. Very, very strange indeed. The other thing that is quite interesting about the aftermath of the fire is that the Earl of Northampton goes to Parliament to get this system of the Fire Commission Act passed, which gives the power to the commissioners to straighten roads, to determine building materials, and basically control the rebuilding of Northampton.
Yes.
And there's a really interesting story told by the town clerk, a man called Henry Lee, and he describes the king, it's the Cavalier Parliament, it's a very long parliament, it goes on for years and years and years, but the king is just about to prorogue Parliament for a long period of time, and the Earl of Northampton needs this rebuilding act enshrined in law, and he hears the Parliament's going to be prorogued, and he races to I presume Whitehall Palace, and he meets the king in his robes on his way to prorogue Parliament.
Yes.
And he says to the king, can you just wait while I get this bill through? And there's a really interesting exchange. The king says, you're very good to Northampton because Northampton wasn't very good to you, because Northampton indeed was a centre of nonconformity,
Yes.
and it's a parliamentarian town. And the Earl of and the Earl of Northampton's father, he and his father had fought for the Cavalier cause, and his father had been killed at an engagement in Shropshire, a place called Hopton Heath, and he was a very celebrated Cavalier commander, and he was such a trophy that his body was actually carried around and displayed by Parliament until it began to decompose, and it was then buried at Derby. So the King's comment about how Northampton hasn't been good to, I think maybe he says to your father or to you, I can't remember. And the Earl says, well, I've forgiven Northampton. And the King says, if you've forgiven Northampton, then so shall I. And he waits until this bill passes through the House of Lords and then signs it into law, and suddenly that the commission, has agency, as it were, and the rebuilding of Northampton can begin. And really interestingly, one of the things the Act stipulates is that you have to rebuild within 3 years, or you lose your property.
Yes.
And the other thing it says is if you're an outsider and you build in the town, I think it's also in 3 years, you automatically have civic rights in Northampton. You have freedom of the town. So it's a moment both where people are trying to, they see the potential both of reviving the town through getting new blood in, but also if you don't have the means to rebuild, you're out on your ear.
Yes, I see. Gosh. Quite harsh.
It is. I mean, in many ways, pretty harsh.
Isn't it interesting that Charles II and the Earl of Northampton should have had that exchange? A reminder that these wounds from the Civil War
are still raw,
very deep.
Well, I mean,
and how difficult it would have been to knit society together. And of course, obviously, Charles II himself had many reasons to remember them.
Well, I'm sure at some level also it's personal. I mean, I don't know whether the Earl of Northampton's body is actually taken to Northampton, but of course he's a Cavalier commander in the Midlands. I mean, he's involved in at Banbury and in a sort of a band of campaigns right across the Midlands of England. And so presumably some of the people that he and his son have fought against are still alive. They're still,
yes, of course.
You can still imagine they're there.
Living in Northampton.
Living in Northampton. Yeah. And it is interesting too that it does have, before the Civil War, it has all these nonconformists and things within it. It is a town that almost determines its sympathies when the Civil War begins and when Charles I's religious reforms. So there's quite an interesting, way in which it's definitely on the parliamentarian side. The interesting thing is, of course, I think as a result of the fire, as we'll talk about, I mean, I think it becomes a much more royalist town in sympathy afterwards because the king actually is very generous to the town.
Well, of course, the king was much engaged, wasn't he? He was very engaged with the fire of London. And I think the Duke of York, I mean, this is his brother, future James II, he went out and was actively helping. Possibly the king was too, kind of stripped to his shirt.
That's right. I think they're both involved.
Helping the Lord Mayor pull down houses and to provide. I think the Lord Mayor, in the case of the Great Fire, was a bit sort of paralysed by it all to begin with, and royal authority was needed to kind of activate the measures, the coordination, but nobody knew what their authority was to pull down other people's houses.
And the enormity of what was going on. I mean, the Fire of London burns for days. It's 3 days, isn't it? I mean, I don't think you can really imagine what that feels like when everything is just being destroyed.
Yes.
And how on earth you cope. It is, I mean, it's worth saying that in Northampton, we do know that, there are fire precautions, but they're almost, laughably minimal. That there are fire buckets. There are hooks for pulling thatch off roofs, and there are ladders, and these are distributed between the parish churches of the town. I mean, it's almost, it's almost meaningless. And one of these accounts says that because it's a Monday morning in the middle of the day, everybody's out and about their business, so there's no one to help. So again,
I see. You mean they've all gone out of town?
They've gone out of town, or they're somewhere else in the town doing things, and so there isn't the labour to do anything. I mean, you can imagine these are things that you have to respond to absolutely spontaneously. There is no outside force that's going to come and help. You need to organise the town. But I mean, it's the scale of the destruction is enormous, and the example of London is clearly very strong. That's what they're looking to as a blueprint for how to rebuild. And, with the commissioners in place, they're in the starting blocks to begin, reconstructing the town.
Yes. Of course, after the Great Fire of London, there were building acts, and they completely changed the way that London looked. But all these things were local, weren't they?
They were.
I think so. So the building acts don't apply to the whole country.
Oh no, they definitely
just literally
don't apply
just apply to London.
But again,
did Northampton have that sort of measure?
Well, so a lot of the documentation is missing, but it's quite clear. As I say, that one of the commissioners of the fire in London is also a commissioner. I think actually a commissioner in Northampton. He lives on the outskirts of the town. He's a lawyer. So there's a very keen awareness of what's just happened in London. And as we'll discuss in the second part, the town is rebuilt in of course, we don't really know what the materials were before because they're all burnt. But it's a stone. Afterwards, it's stone built. So there is again this awareness of how, there is control over materials. The commissioners have the right to tell you how you can build a house. So you must assume that in fact, tacitly, these things are being passed through to Northampton.
But was there actually a framework of law? So it can't just be in social pressure because it would have been so expensive to build instead.
No, well, this is the point. The commissioners have the power.
Oh, I see. They've got the power.
They can just tell you what you have to do, and they can straighten roads and do different things.
Probably much easier to do on the scale of Northampton because these towns were so small, really, weren't they?
They are. 700 families, when the whole of the centre of Northampton is burnt out. It's a lot of people, but actually...
But so it must have been what? How many would that be? 3,000 people or something? And that's not much more than a big village. Indeed. So, to sort out Northampton, I don't know how many people were living in London in the mid-17th century, probably not that many, but anyway, many, many more than Northampton.
Though I suppose, again, you mustn't underestimate what how enormous the problem seemed to be.
Yeah, to them.
Exactly.
Yes, when lost everything.
But everything has gone. And I think it's important to point out, too, that the pamphlets that are published about the fire, they're quite short. I think there are 3 of them, all published within 1675, all, again, revealingly published in London. But they spread the word. They make this, what's happened in Northampton, a national event. They raise national consciousness of it.
Yes.
And that, as you were saying with Marlborough, it means that people are going to give money, as we'll find out in part 2, people give money all the way, from all around the country. And that is one of the things that helps the town recover.
Yes. Yes. But I think it's true to say that in those days, obviously this is before there were, in fact, before banks at all really had been established in the way that we know them. And so a lot of people had their entire wealth in their house, didn't they? That's correct, isn't it?
Well, this is what happens.
Unless you owned a lot of land outside.
No, well, indeed, that's why everybody is stacking their goods up in the marketplace and in the church. That's why it's so...
So, they didn't just lose their houses, they actually lost everything. So I wonder how they managed to do this rebuilding.
Well,
you're going to tell it.
We're going to tell us in part 2.
Yes. The talking clock on the mantelpiece is ticking towards our patch.
Yes, all right. Well, we'll come back.
Our new digital timer is what I'm talking about.
No, and they get an architect in or someone with real expertise.
I can't wait.
So we'll hear about that.
Fantastic.
Excellent.
John, what are we going to do in the second part? Are you going to tell us about Northampton?
Yes, and just the process of rebuilding it and how that happens. Because
can you remind me, or the audience, what Northampton looks like? Because I have been actually a number of times, but not recently.
Well, the truth is that what Northampton looks like today is nothing like what it looked like after it was rebuilt after the fire.
Oh.
So it is actually slightly confusing. But if you imagine it rises up a hillside above a river. I can't now immediately remember what the river is.
Neen would have been? No, I don't know.
It's got a very large marketplace. The street plan basically survives from the Middle Ages. So, despite the fire, although they straighten streets and things and reorganise streets, the essential street plan survives. So there's a central marketplace.
So this was part of the learning from the Great Fire.
So the way that they rebuild is past the learning from the Great Fire of London. But what's really interesting is that we know that in 1677 there's a document about rebuilding the main church of All Saints, which is the parish church which burns down with all the contents and people's contents inside it. There's a document there which mentions two people who are involved in rebuilding the town, effectively professionals, if you can use that term. One is a man called Henry Bell, and the other is a man called Edward Edwards. And
Welsh, possibly.
No, I think, but Henry Bell is a really interesting character, one of these fascinating late 17th century builders, architects, designers. He's from a big family in King's Lynn, big merchant family in King's Lynn. He's a rich figure. He travels abroad. He goes on a sort of grand tour, and in the aftermath of the Civil War, he returns, and this seems to be seems to be invited to Northampton, basically on the back of no experience whatsoever, other than a strong interest in architecture, to help redesign the town. Now, it's worth saying that most of what we know about Bell in this, very first commission when he gets engaged in architecture comes from a posthumously published treatise on painting. There's a preface to it, an anonymous preface that credits him with overseeing the rebuilding of the town.
How fascinating! And
it seems that he is. One possible link is that the rector of All Saints has very strong Norfolk connections, and it's possible that he knows Bell through these connections and employs him. And it's just
in this age before there were architects as we understand them, and gentlemen or scholars or whoever they might be, people like Christopher Wren could suddenly become people who design buildings.
Yes.
Travel was regarded as being a kind of important thing that was a qualification. And wasn't that true of Roger Pratt, for example, who was one of the big architects at the time, who didn't have any training on how to actually construct things, but he had travelled widely and he'd seen things in Italy, and so, or possibly France, and so he knew about taste.
I think that's exactly
Henry
right.
Bell.
It fits into the same thing. And I mean, the preface that describes his involvement describes him as travelling to the politer parts of Europe, whatever that means. But I mean, we presume that certainly that means the Low Countries, Holland, probably also, or possibly Italy. I mean, it's actually very difficult to know. Exactly. It's completely mysterious. But the fact that he writes a treatise on painting again illustrates the fact that
he was a virtuoso.
He's a virtuoso.
Yeah.
So latterly he's involved in all kinds of projects in King's Lynn, of which my favourite one, and which listeners may well know, is the Customs House in King's Lynn.
Yes.
That really handsome kind of sort of almost square building with a hipped roof, right on the water side and the quay and King's Lynn. But he designs the
King's
marketplace.
Lynn, of course, yes, as well as no fire, but that's another beautiful 17th century
city.
Town. So there must have been a lot of activity there.
And indeed, King's Lynn, I think, obviously it's a medieval town too, with important medieval buildings surviving, but those two great marketplaces in King's Lynn, Northampton, he creates one big marketplace.
Yes.
Like that at Northampton before King's Lynn. So I think there are, you can kind of read between the two parallels. And,
of course, King's Lynn was one of the richest cities.
It's a very, very rich, it's a very wealthy town. And so we know that these two figures, but by the by, we know practically nothing about Edwards. But we
Surely it wasn't Welsh.
Well, we imagine that, I imagine that he must have some direct connection with Henry Bell, and therefore is probably from Norfolk as well. But I don't know. The I suppose it's to be imagined that Bell designs the sort of straightens out the streetscape. And also seems to impose some kind of regularity on the buildings that individuals are building for themselves through the town. And there's a fascinating series of 1760s watercolours of Northampton. And, honestly, you wouldn't recognise the town at all today. It looks like a parts of Bath, these absolutely straight streets with stone-faced buildings, balconies in many of the buildings, and it just looks, and sash windowed. It looks just, well, not sash window, but rectilinear mullin transom windows. It just looks incredibly regular, and this is what all travellers who go in the late 17th century speak about. Celia thinks the street. She's only seen broader streets, I think she says, in the Strand and Holborn, in comments on what a handsome town it is. Daniel Defoe in the 1720s describes it as the most handsome town in this part of the country. And what's odd is that regularity is gradually ironed out. I mean, Northampton, of course, remains very, very prosperous,
yes.
And that gradually evaporates with rebuildings in the 18th and 19th centuries. And one of the most important buildings fronting onto the main square is an inn called the Peacock. And I mean, tragically, that is demolished in 1960.
Oh no, how's that?
And I mean, it forms one entire side. Pretty much of the main town square, and the replacement building is by no stretch of the imagination an improvement. I mean, just
you astonished me.
Though there are other.
I thought the 60s had done such a lot to ornament towns and cities.
Well, it's a building of no aspiration. Do you know what I mean? It was just knocked down to create modern
commercial
space. Though there is a really good 50s. There are actually some quite interesting, more modern 50s. There's a really good 50s building on the town square, and it's also recently been given a rather stylish going over with the main square. Where you can, however, still see the character of the 17th century building are these two principal civic buildings, All Saints Church and the Sessions House, the courthouse, which are still intact. And again, we imagine that they are both designed by Henry Bell, and with Edwards involved. And certainly the church is under construction from 1677, and the Sessions House seems to be under construction in the early 1680s. And they're an astonishing pair of buildings. They face one another, and immediately between them, or beside them in the group of buildings, is this rather wonderful Lutyens. I think it's one of Lutyens' earliest war memorials at the east end of All Saints Church, with painted flags.
Good heavens,
hanging down.
That. How interesting. Of course, he was very anti-flag. He didn't really like, they're flapped. Well, if it's inside the church, not so much. But
no, this is outside, and they're stone flat. I mean,
that's what. Yes. These painted kind of frozen. It's frozen architecture. They're flags, but they're cut in stone, so they don't distract everybody by flapping around.
Well, it's interesting.
Yeah, he did that. He did that also in his memorials in some of the cemeteries in France. Have these great stone flags, which are moving, really.
Well,
they're not moving. They're stone.
They're stone, and
the point is they're immobile.
Well, it's very beautifully looked after. And then there is also, there's a 19th century, an absolutely sensational 19th century town hall, which is a little bit removed. They've demolished the older town hall. But these two buildings are very individually remarkable. Both of them, the courthouse, which is just presently, I think, under a massive restoration. It hasn't actually operated as a courthouse for quite some time, but it has these two 17th century courtrooms, I think a Nisi Prius court and a Crown Court. And these two...
Explain about a Nisi Prius.
Yeah, no, well, don't press me. I did briefly know, because I had to look it up, but I've completely forgotten.
It's not essential to the story, I don't think, John.
But what's rather wonderful is the Crown Court. There are these extraordinarily rich ceilings, which are created by a London plasterer, very well documented plasterer, who works in lots of different houses, country houses and London buildings. And if you imagine, the courtroom furniture has been adapted over time, but in the band, there's a band of decoration over the judge's bench in this courtroom. And in the middle of it, there's a cherub holding the scales of justice. And on the cherub's right, there are flowers and fruits, very deeply moulded and beautiful, and a little square at the very end of this strip, which has a cherub's face in. But on the left-hand side of the cherub are all these implements of imprisonment. Yeah. And then at the very far left, there's a square with a demon's face in it. And the demon, unbelievably, I almost didn't really believe this till I was shown a photograph of it, and saw it from the inside. The tongue of the demon
Yes.
is worked through a mechanical lever to loll. I mean, it just
No.
and I
You've had that experience.
I sort of was shown it and said, the tongue moves, and I looked up and you could sort of half believe it. But I was then shown, I couldn't go and see it, but I was shown that in the roof space there is actually a mechanism that which would have allowed for the tongue to wag.
So after the judge had sentenced somebody to death,
I think
the demon could stick out his tongue
and wag his tongue. So I think that's exactly what
It's incredible. It's like a sort of, it's like such a folk superstition sort of thing.
Well, it's funny, isn't it? Because I mean, I know that there are these traditions of judges on assize. If nobody's hung, they wore white gloves when they rode out and putting on a black skull cap to pronounce the death sentence and things like this. But I mean, it is odd to see this additional theatrical feature
to kind of terrify ignorant people.
Yeah, well, it's odd, isn't it? Because it's not that terrifying. I mean, it's definitely a detail. I'm afraid to say it feels more like a kind of thing to pantomime to entertain the crowd. You throw them exactly enough. another entertaining execution for their enjoyment. And I mean, it sounds a bit horrible, really.
Yes, quite. For some reason, another very horrible thing comes into my mind, which is the Ku Klux Klan, who used to ride out in these horrible white robes because they gave the impression that they were spirits. And they were trying to terrify the black population, who were regarded as being superstitious or were superstitious. And so
they're assuming a kind of as though they're
yes.
Gosh,
I know it's all ghastly, but
well, I suppose also in the case of justice, it is a very complicated thing, isn't it? Because judges have to pretend to be a different persona, don't they? When they send people down, that you sort of stand almost. You become you cease to be a human being. You become something different, and your robes convey the way in which you separate yourself from ordinary humanity, and yet it's just a theatrical illusion because, of course, you're part of the same thing yourself. It's an odd.
John, can I spool back to the sash window?
Yes.
I mean, it would have been possible for them to be sash windows,
but
yes,
just, and there may indeed have been sash windows in the town.
But they would have been very much at the head of the game.
So the 1660s are the first sash windows, and
is at Newmarket.
Exactly,
the palace is
Royal, Palace of Newmarket.
The Royal Palace at Newmarket.
The
very first sash window, huge development for British architecture, and indeed of some influence in this very house.
Yes,
I mean, every house in London has
sash windows
at a certain time.
Indeed. So for those not familiar with this is basically windows of two sections that slide, where the sections slide up and down over one another to open them. And this is a development probably first introduced to England, indeed, in Charles II's palace at Newmarket in the 1660s, and which by the mid-18th century is absolutely universal. I think in Northampton, I only hesitate because the Sessions House definitely has mullioned transom windows, namely stone vertical bars like a cross, vertical and horizontal bars like a cross that fill the rectangular opening of the window, and
the windows hinge out.
And then there are casement windows, hinging windows within those. So I mean, but the Sessions House is it's very ornately carved. It fronts what was the town prison, and it's a really wonderful and remarkable survival. It's very sad. I mean, I think across the country, one of the problems is that there are these very elaborately constructed courtrooms, and in fact, very, very few of them function any longer, and there is no obvious purpose for them, and they're all furnished. I mean, they're like, I suppose they're
like churches, really.
Well, in some ways, there is an analogy with churches which have very intrusive furnishings that they're sort of unusable for anything other than the purpose that. Yes, I mean, so it is. It will be interesting to see what happens in the long term with those buildings because they're magnificent.
Yes, that's true. But then you wouldn't have thought that, say, somewhere like the Midland Bank headquarters could have been converted into a hospitality space with in the huge Lutyens banking hall there are 7 restaurants and it's been done brilliantly.
But dare I say it, the crucial difference is that all these courtrooms are in county towns which are themselves usually in course of, economic decline or struggling.
Yes,
And
yes, of course, that's another issue.
Lutchins is in the middle of the city, which is
Yes.
booming, and there's money to spare. I mean, every county town has courtrooms, and I don't know if any of them, from the most splendid Regency ones at Lancashire, in Lancaster, all the way, through to, I don't know, Stafford, Warwick, Northampton, you name it. They all have these courtroom buildings, and it's simply not clear what you can do with them, and they're all struggling for a use, it seems to me. And in many cases,
who owns them, John? I mean, they're all still owned by
I think
the Crown.
What do you know? That's a really interesting
Because
question.
ownership is possibly an issue.
Well, many of them are in town halls. I mean, in Chester, there are courts,
Yes.
I seem to remember, in the town hall. Of course, in Liverpool, St George's Hall, it has these courtrooms.
Yes, of course. Conveniently, both a concert hall and a jail.
And a jail and a courtroom.
Who would have thought?
And I mean, they're sort of, and I suppose the other thing is they're absolutely magnificent, and yet they simply don't conform anymore to a functional court space. Anyway, I don't know. It's a problem to be teased over. But the other building, of course, which we must talk about, is the church, All Saints.
Yes, which of course is extremely handsome.
Which is a really,
Beautiful
really
tower.
handsome. Exactly. It's quite complicated. If you imagine, it seems to be the case that the medieval church was enormous, and it had a central tower and it was cross-shaped, and the fire basically burns everything out, and they rebuild the new church using the medieval tower, recycling the medieval tower, and they clear everything else away, and they build a new church on a rectangular plan with a chancel to the east of the tower. So the central tower becomes a western tower. And again, all the parallels seem to be with London. The plan of the building, it's sort of...
So there's a big portico.
There's a big portico which looks very like...
St Martin's.
In
the fields.
Well, I was going to say Old St Paul's.
I see. Okay, right.
Inigo Jones's Old St Paul's. So,
but the arrangement of portico and tower would be
indeed
prescient of Gibbs's much later St Martin in the Fields on Trafalgar Square.
Exactly. It is. You're absolutely right. And the portico has a big inscription running across it, referring to Charles II, who gives 1,000 or 2,000 tons of oak for the rebuilding of the town, and also gives 7 years of what is described as chimney money. Now, the chimney money...
Ironic.
This is a reference to a deeply unpopular late 17th century tax, which we often call the hearth tax, which was levied on every single hearth in the kingdom. And there are certain classes of people who are exempted from it. But it's a tax...
You have to pay double if it was a second home.
Well, it's a really fascinating taxation. It's a very fascinating piece of evidence, because you get, when the tax collectors go out, sorry, I'm losing my words, tax collectors go out, they basically list everybody who's the head of the household and how many hearths there are. So you can reconstruct where these things survive. You can reconstruct absolutely precisely who's living in different houses. And of course, for country houses, it can be very useful, because if there's a big country house, it can sometimes help you work out who's living at a particular place at a particular time, or whether alterations take place. Anyway, there are various years. Initially, the tax is done directly by the Treasury, but then it's farmed out. That's to say, somebody goes to says, I will collect the tax for you in Northamptonshire, and the Treasury says, okay, will you pay so much to us, and then you just get on with it.
Yeah.
And they will, of course, make a very big profit.
And if you take a bit more, or a lot more.
Exactly.
It's all bounced.
We're asking no questions. You just get on with it. In London, the hearth tax is remitted for 7 years.
In Northampton?
In London. In London.
Yes.
So after the Great Fire, the hearth tax is remitted for 7 years. Now, something similar happens in Northampton, but as far as I actually find it quite difficult to work out exactly what happened, because the town asks, as for London, for 7 years remittance from the hearth tax to help pay for the rebuilding. But the Treasury writes a note saying it would be very, very inconvenient to remit the tax for 7 years. Why don't you give them 7 years tax from the rest of Northamptonshire? But as far as there's a sort of contradiction, because it seems as though the town continued paying hearth tax, and then that money from the town hearth tax was given for the rebuilding. What's
Oh.
very weird about that is after the town is just burnt down,
wouldn't have
it's
been
not,
any hearths.
it's not clear to me what hearths there would have been. So I don't really understand what exactly happened, but it is the case that the king in some way gives those 7 years of hearth tax, whatever he gives, back to the town to reinvest. And also, at the same time, these pamphlets have raised large sums of money from towns all over the kingdom. I mean, there's a painted board in the parish church which describes these bequests from, some from Manchester, for example, some from York, but also nearly £5,000 from London. And so all this money is being, I think, poured into the town, and I presume in the main to help rebuild it, and presumably to support people in the rebuilding of their properties within 3 years. But again, the documentation is lost. It's not quite clear how this is happening. The church itself, I should just say that going back to the church in which this board of donors, painted board hangs, if the porch is inspired by Old St Paul's, the nave seems to be inspired by Wren's Church of St Mary on the Hill, which is, so it's square with a central dome supported on 4 columns, and then there's a chancel projecting at one end of it. And again, there's very, very rich plasterwork, undoubtedly by the same, team who've done the Sessions House. But the interior preserves, its pulpit. It has an organ from only slightly later in the, a few decades later, very elaborate organ case. It has boards showing Moses and Aaron. It has royal arms, thrones for there's a sort of a throne-like seat for the mayor of Northampton to sit in the church, all surviving within this building. Many of them, these furnishings have been reconfigured, but I mean, it's a really elaborate and splendid 17th century
this
building.
again have been the Earl of Northampton, do you think, behind it?
Well, I suppose he may have had a lot to do,
because the town itself was now wiped out.
Yes,
It had no money, presumably. How did they raise the money for the church?
Well, I think they must have. This is presumably where the money that's being raised in London and other places is being diverted. Yes. And, we also know that Robert Hooke, who's very involved in the rebuilding of London, he does meet with Henry Bell. And
rather repulsive man, but
really,
a good architect.
A good architect.
Oh, very unpleasant.
Really?
In a number of ways.
Well, I mean,
not the ideal dinner companion.
Really, you think? Well, well, that's rather fascinating response. I mean,
let's not be diverted.
Let's not be diverted. But Henry Bell and he definitely meet I think it's again in 1677, and presumably they discuss the problems of rebuilding the town and what you can do. So again, at every level, there are these really fascinating relationships and parallels with London, with Northampton sort of following in the footsteps of the capital. And I suppose what is so remarkable is the sheer quality and conformity of the architecture, which is what people really, really admire subsequently. But I mean, that, as I say, has been almost entirely effaced now, though the church and the Sessions House are this one place where you still get a sense of both the scale and the spirit of that 17th century rebuilding.
John, I have to say, I can't quite remember, but we will be, I hope, going through Northampton, because we are making a journey to Northamptonshire with none other than Alice Loxton quite shortly. Who will be joining for our very first guest on our podcast.
Indeed.
And we're going to Geddington, which is another completely nothing to do with Northampton, really. But
but it is, because another of the Eleanor Crosses.
Oh, my goodness me. We're going on a pilgrimage to Eleanor Crosses.
We're going to be following the funeral cortege of Eleanor of Castile, the wife of Edward I, and these crosses that are erected on her funeral path.
To a place very close to my heart, since I had a little cottage, which was
in
right
Geddington,
next to the Eleanor Cross in Geddington. But anyway, John, what I was going to ask was this, I can't quite remember, but is the stone in Northamptonshire, is it that orangey, that iron stone, there's a lot of iron in it, which I mean, certainly there's a lot around Geddington.
Indeed, it's very, very good building stone,
but it's this orangey colour, is it? I mean, as opposed to
golden.
Yes. But it's not like bar stone, which is all.
No, it's not. Yeah. No, and I mean, it should be said that exactly as we've said, with regards to materials in London, London is really being rebuilt in brick after the Great Fire of London because there are lots of clay. It's easy to get access to. In Northampton, the whole town seems to be being rebuilt in stone facings, really.
Which is, I mean, again, a tremendous labour.
It's an enormous labour. And it's quite an interesting, I mean, it is interesting, isn't it, to think of a town that, the population there familiar with the town, and it's totally destroyed. I suppose it's like bombing, isn't it? Or something terrifying like that. But that, you have this opportunity to rethink the town. The town actually, in many ways, closely resembles the plan of the old town, because people they don't want to lose property, so it's constrained by all these things, and yet the new town is recreated in many ways in a completely different spirit to the old, and there is a uniformity to it, which is clearly very, very impressive to a late 17th and early 18th century audience. But
a big transformation since it was before ragged.
Yes.
And it was ragged was the word.
Ragged is the word John Evelyn uses. And John Evelyn goes back and says how, impressive it is. A lot of the people who go comment on the quality of the inns in Northampton. Again, it's a staging town, a coaching town, and the Peacock, which is demolished in the 1960s, is clearly one of these inns that they're very impressed by. Has this enormously broad, uniform frontage. So it's very interesting. I suppose it illustrates too the love of the 17th century on uniformity, when it's like terraces of 18th century houses, this way in which you can get lots of different units and you join them together, and you actually get if they're sufficiently uniform, they create a really impressive frontage.
Yes. It's one of the things that the architect Ben Pentreath says, that you can people enjoy this sense of uniformity. I mean, nobody's walking around Edinburgh Newtown saying, let's have lots more variety in this, because the uniformity is satisfying, and you have a church that gives enough variety. But if you have terraces which all look the same, they can be pleasing.
They can be
Bath or any of these, or Bedford Square.
Osbert Lancaster writes very, very brilliantly about this. I mean, he comments about this desire for endless independence of form, and says that, this idea, people pursuing an idea of difference that the buildings they create do not in reality possess. So everybody wants a different, a detached house that looks slightly different from their neighbours, and they think that by doing that they're creating difference and identity, but in fact they're so similar.
The volume of the house is identical.
It's identical.
It's just the twiddly bits.
Exactly, and therefore, in fact, the differences end up, clashing with one another and underlining the fact they are all the same, but actually, displeasingly, they're just all slightly
Strangely, this wasn't a Victorian approach. I mean, the Victorians hated places like the London terraces and Bloomsbury Square, and they thought they were intensely boring and oppressive.
Well, I sometimes...
But of course, they got all black and decayed by then, I suppose.
And yes, I suppose so. But I mean, I'm always struck. It is something I register a lot as how dull, but how attractively dull a lot of Georgian and early Regency architecture is. I mean, it's not as they're boxes with big windows and
can easily be run up by builders.
And and so when people criticised, new buildings that are boxes with glass windows, I think, well, actually, they're pretty much the same, but just bigger than the boxes with windows that the Georgians were running up. I mean, and there is something pleasing about, high-ceilinged interiors. There's a very funny passage I seem to remember to Smollett writes in Roderick. Is it Roderick Random? There's a very funny passage about Bath.
Yes,
and and how absurd. I think Smollett knows what's his name of
Ralph,
Bath, the builder of Bath, John Wood of Bath,
and Ralph Allen was the man of the stone, wasn't he? Yeah.
Anyway, but he writes quite a funny passage, I think, satirising the design of the layout of Bath with all these strange forms in geometric forms, and says, none of the rooms can be quite square, and how bizarre that must be. But I mean, is
it Humphrey Clinker, maybe?
It is Humphrey Clinker. Yeah. It's not Roderick Random. But that is another Smollett novel. But I don't know why that comes to my mind instead.
It wasn't Roderick Random because I haven't read it.
It can't be. But yes, Humphrey Clinker. It is indeed but also rather strange and fun book.
Which has wonderful accounts about, oh, look, John is pointing at the clock, our new piece of technology, and saying it's time to wrap up. But before we end, John, I must just say we've had fan mail, and thank you to those people who have supported us.
Oh, very good.
Such as Charles Somery-Smith.
Oh, yes, no.
Not only a former director of the National Gallery and the Royal Academy, but also, really, we can call him Mr. Vanbrugh and Mr. Castle Howard.
Well, very
because
generous.
He wrote a book on Castle Howard, and he's writing a book on Vanbrugh at this moment. He's written on his blog some very kind words about our Castle Howard episode.
Well, that's very generous of him. Maybe
And we have also had a email to our White Pom Pod website, but I can't reply to it. And I can't because it's not possible. They don't allow you to reply, but I've just got to say to whoever wrote it. And I don't know who this is, but it could be a Mr., a Mrs., or a Miss, or any of the other possibilities available to the modern man. But she says that it's like being a fly on the wall of the Country Life Architectural Department. I don't know whether that's an imaginary comment or whether this is somebody who knows of
How bizarre.
But this unnamed person has written an email which it's impossible to reply to the emails from that platform.
But thank
But
you.
we're very,
Thank you very much.
and it's lovely. It's lovely to have a response. I mean, do email us. We'd be absolutely thrilled. And do visit our website, www.ypompod.com.
Excellent.
What else do we have to say? Yes, till next time.
Till next week.
We don't know what we're going to talk about.
Oh, yes, we do.
Oh, we do?
We do.
We do. Are we going to keep it a secret?
Yes, we are.
Brilliant.